Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. So this week I'm going to do a little bit more of painting out in the open air, but unlike previous videos where I've been at the beach or down at the river, I thought I'd show you a little spot that I only discovered maybe within the last year actually. So as you can see, I'm just entering the churchyard at a little village called Newton St Cyres, which is a couple of miles outside of Exeter. If you ever want to find this arboretum where I'm about to take you, then Newton St Cyres is about halfway between Exeter and the town of Crediton. Anyway, so you walk through this churchyard. So it's a lovely little church, nice little walk. And part of the reason I'm showing this actually is this arboretum is actually quite tricky to find if you don't know where it is. So that's why I'm kind of showing you the lead up. And also, you know, it's quite a pleasant setting as well. Alright, so approaching the end of the path now, and there's a quick look at the rather picturesque little church, and I've actually got a couple of plans for different paintings of that church lined up as well, so I hope to show you those at some point in the future. But once you reach the edge of the churchyard, you keep going, and then you continue along this little path, and there are actually signs, arboretum, there you go, and then when you come across along this little path here, and then there's a gate on the left, and then you're into the arboretum. So while I'm walking to the spot, let me show you a couple of the paintings that I've done inspired by this place previously. Now, on these previous occasions, I wasn't painting from life, I wasn't painting in the open air. I simply took a couple of reference photos, and then I did a couple of paintings inspired by what I'd seen. So here's the first painting. So kind of a tunnel of foliage and a nice sense of light in this one, I think. And then in the second painting, this was more of a stylized interpretation. So lots of acrylic washes and textures. So it's a mixed media study. I used pens on top of the painted washes that I put down. But anyway, let's get into the painting itself. So having walked deeper into the arboretum, I set up my little field easel. I'm working away on the mixed media boards, so this is the same surface as the mixed media paper that I often use, but it's bonded to a rigid piece of board, so it's much better for working outdoors. And I'm just putting in some line work now, quite quickly and loosely, describing the outlines of different trees and bushes using a watercolour marker pen. And after I've done this, what I do is I switch to the interactive acrylic paints by Chroma. So what I'll do, as usual, is in the description below the video, I will list all the different materials I've used. So if you want to try something similar and you want to use exactly the same brushes and paints and things that I've used, then you can just check that list. As you can see, I'm using a green watercolour marker today. A little bit unusual for me actually. Normally I fire in with the blue at the start of the painting. So but having done that, I'm now using some cadmium yellow, quite dilute, and I'm using a 1-inch flat brush. And you can see that I'm just tapping that rather loosely, keeping the brush marks pointing upwards for the most part, over some of the watercolour marks that I've put down already. Now, because the watercolour is going to dissolve a little bit with the wet paint on top, then I automatically get some little bursts of green in amongst this yellow. But the idea I'm working on with this particular little outdoor sketch is, even though I'm using acrylic, I'm kind of using a watercolour technique and approach. So I'm starting with the lighter colours and keeping the layers fairly thin, and then as things move on, I'll gradually make the colours darker and darker. Once again, I'm painting a landscape, but I've got my paper or my board orientated in what is traditionally a portrait orientation, and that's something I quite enjoy doing. Like I've mentioned, I think in previous videos, it really makes me focus on a particular part of the landscape. So I'm starting to block in the sky now, and I'm using a mixture of titanium white and cerulean blue, and notice how my brush strokes have changed compared to my treatment of the foliage. So I'm keeping the brush strokes for the most part horizontal and quite smooth. I didn't talk about it before, but when I blocked in the grassy area, then that was done quite quickly, but also with fairly smooth brush strokes. So I'm keeping in mind the different textures of paint that I apply as I move around the picture. So kind of more textured marks for the foliage and smoother regions which will contrast with those textured regions for the sky and for the lawn. Now what I'm doing here is just adding a few bursts of that same blue in amongst the first wash of yellow. The idea being to show little bits of sky coming in through the foliage, and I'll probably at least partially cover up many of those patches. But the idea is to do it now so it's exactly the same blue that I'm putting in for the main part of the sky, so I don't have to come back and try and match colour or anything too tricky like that. Because one of the fun things about working outside is that it's not ideal, so I try to work as efficiently as possible and keep things fairly loose, and just try and be open-minded about what happens as well. So I just kind of scumbled the brush over those very distant trees, or the more distant trees I should say, the pines or the conifers at least, and that kind of didn't give me the effect I wanted, so I just kind of wiped off some of the paint, and you can see I've more or less blocked out my initial mark now with the sky. But we'll come back in a bit and pop those trees back in there. So I started off with the cadmium yellow, then I used the cerulean blue in the sky, and again trying to be efficient, I've now mixed in some of that yellow with the blue to give me a light green, and as you can see I'm now adding that on top of some of the yellow that I put down. So we can try to be efficient in terms of our observation, we can try to be efficient in terms of the way we draw, try to be efficient in terms of which part of the landscape we select, and we can also try to be efficient in our use of colour and the order in which we mix things. And that's not to say I'm sort of really strict on this, not at all. I don't make a list of the steps I'm going to take in advance or anything like that. But what I try to do is just think ahead a little bit, and if I see an opportunity to, especially if I'm working outside, if I see an opportunity where I can go, oh hang on, I've got those two colours, I may as well mix them and use the third colour now, then I'll go ahead and do that. So, as you saw a little while ago, I obliterated my initial marks for these conifers, so I've now come back in with a similar green to before. Well, the wind's picking up a little bit, even in the height of summer, can't guarantee calm conditions. And you can see I'm putting on rather loose and streaked marks of a slightly darker green for those distant conifers. So initially I used vertically upsweeping brush strokes to get the general form of the trees, and now I'm doing some light horizontal or diagonally downwards feathering to begin to suggest the sort of feathery shape of those conifers. You can see those at you could at the top left of the screen, right at the top there, if you sort of rewind a little bit. Moving back over to the right hand side of the painting now, and I'm using a slightly deeper green and just picking out selective sort of mid-range shadows in amongst the leaves of the trees on the right there. And then using that same green, just quite loosely and using more sweeping brush strokes, just kind of blocking in or beginning to block in. We'll probably come back with a darker colour in a moment, but just blocking in the shadow areas which occupy the lower parts of the trees, where they join the ground. So really I'm just killing the white of the paper here. While I've got that mid-dark green on my brush, may as well fill in some of these shadowy regions. So a quick spray with the water bottle allows me to move the interactive acrylics over the surface of the paper and do a quick bit of blending. And now I'm coming in with a slightly darker colour again. So obviously to mix up a green, you can typically combine blue and yellow. Generally speaking, I always use the same yellow within a particular painting. That's usually cadmium yellow. And then I'll often use 3 different blues depending on what I'm doing. The most common ones I use are ultramarine blue and cerulean blue, but I do sometimes use cobalt blue as well, or even phthalocyanine blue, or phthalo blue I think it's called. And then of course once you've got those different greens, you can always add a touch of red or magenta to it, or even a touch of burnt umber to just give you a little bit more variation. It really depends on the effect you're going for. I often use deliberately quite vibrant colours because that's one of the things I enjoy doing, seeing how I can get these vibrant colours. Oh, so what I'm showing you now just on screen for a few seconds is just a little burst of the sky, so you can kind of get a little bit better feel of what I'm actually painting. And now we're back to the normal view. But going back to chatting about greens, I enjoy using a lot of quite bright colours deliberately and seeing how they play against each other. But if you're after a more realistic effect and a more sort of near photographic range of colours, then generally speaking you want to make your colours a little bit more towards the tertiary. So if you mix up a green with a blue and a yellow, add a touch of the red or magenta just to take away some of that vibrancy. And obviously it depends what you're trying to achieve. There will still be parts even within a realistic depiction which will be very vibrant and bright. Certainly in a summer scene in the English countryside, but there are a lot of browns obviously and sort of yellow ochre type colours, and if you mix those in with your greens, just do it gradually, then it's a good way to really explore the huge range of different colours you can get. But while I was chatting away there, I blocked in the left hand tree with a sort of even darker green verging on the dark blue really, so a lot more ultramarine there. And I did that with dilute paint, so I sprayed the paint on my palette, and that allows me to drag the paint across the surface of the painting in a thin layer and get this textured effect. I've also done a little more work on the distant conifers, and now I'm adding in some deliberately bluey shadows onto the tree on the right. So again, we've talked about texture earlier. A quick recap of that again. The sky, very smooth texture. The foreground grass, very smooth texture with some blending of shadows into the light regions. The tree on the right, from the beginning right up until what I'm doing now, I'm keeping the brush strokes quite short and I'm just dabbing the paint onto the painting. The distant conifers, smooth upward and light feathering brush strokes. And then the tree on the left, broader, fatter, more textured, thin layers of paint. So I've defined quite clearly 5 different regions on my picture here. Smooth sky, smooth lawn, textured tree on the right, different texture on the left, and then a third texture in the distance as well. But while I was chatting away there, I've been adding some purpley shadows, so I've now mixed in some magenta with the dark colour that I had before. And again, I may have mentioned before, but if you're used to using red, yellow and blue as your primaries, I would highly recommend including magenta on your palette, because it opens up a much wider range of colours that you can mix. With red, blue and yellow, it's really convenient because you've got a red there ready to go, whereas if you had only magenta instead of red, you'd have to mix up a red every time you wanted it with magenta and yellow. But if you have 4, red, yellow, blue and magenta, then you can sort of access the entire spectrum of colours that can be mixed with those paints. And well, it just gives you it's another tool in the toolbox for depicting what you want or achieving certain effects. So as you can see, I've blocked in some of the deeper shadows now to help me kind of refine the shape of the right hand tree somewhat. I've also introduced the presence of some branches in the right hand tree with some rather narrower lines and a deeper blue, which I'm now also including, keeping the brush strokes nice and broad on the left hand tree. So you can see there was a little time jump in the video there. That's simply because I've cut out the time it's taken me to mix my paint in the palette. And I'm just starting to add some very deep shadows with a little bit of red mixed in, underneath this tree on the left. If you look at the top left of the screen, you can just see that left-hand tree that I'm painting peeking out on the left, and you can see the foliage is quite a deep red, so that's why I'm using this colour. And I'm just kind of scumbling that over the top of the textured blue marks that I put down earlier. Continuing to work into this left-hand tree, you can see that I'm keeping the treatment of everything in this painting very loose. This is intended as a quick study. It's an outdoor study, so I'm very much just trying to capture the essence of the scene. There isn't really time to precisely depict little clumps of foliage or do individual leaves and things like that. So I'm layering on some of these deeper reddish purpley shadows now on the left. And then, having done that, what I'm doing at the moment is I'm just trying to pull out some of the highlights. So again, if you look at the top left-hand corner of the screen, the edge of that reddish tree is coming in on the left there. And there are some highlighted regions on that which are sort of quite a bright orangey brown. So I'm just adding some of those now. And some of those could probably do with being a bit lighter, if I'm being honest, and some of my shadows on this tree on the left could do with being quite a lot darker, as could some of the shadows in the lower region for the tree on the right. But again, it's all about trying to do what you can in the time and keeping things consistent within the painting. So if I go very, very dark on the left, all of a sudden the shadows on the right will look even lighter, and I'll have to darken those even more. So for the purposes of this little outing, this one's coming close to completion, I think. We just need to add a few more touches. So I'm adding some sort of feathered brush strokes now, similar technique to what I used on the conifers, but different direction of brush stroke to try and capture the way the leaves are falling on the left-hand tree. So when I paint hair, if I'm doing a portrait or if I'm doing a horse's tail or something, I try to look at it as if it's just a lump, a mass, and paint it very much as just a lump of clay or something with a dark, a light region, and then a mid-tone region. And then I'll add some texture on top of that. And that's kind of the approach I've tried to take with these trees. Just block in the area, add some regions of shadows, add some highlights, and then a little bit of texture at the end, if I feel it's necessary. So adding a little bit more texture, or continuing that texture, different shapes of brushstroke to that tree on the left. But that's this one pretty much done, I think. So I hope you've enjoyed this little outing to the secret arboretum with me for some open air painting. As usual, I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. And if it's your first time here, please remember to subscribe to the channel. I look forward to seeing you next Sunday. Thanks very much for watching.